you if you came to Washington D.C. in the 1980s and 1990s, and you came there today, it's just undeniable that the city has changed. So I became interested in how the city has changed, in part because I don't live there anymore. And every time I go back, it's like, oh, wow, the city has changed. And I also became interested in thinking about how people who experience incarceration, because the other thing that happened in the 1980s is Washington, D.C. experienced a wave of mass incarceration. Actually, in 1997, Washington, D.C. had the highest rate of incarceration in the world. And the average length of incarceration was actually 8 years. So a lot of people who were incarcerated in the 1990s are coming back in the 2000s to a changed city. So I was curious as to how people who are returning home from prison were experiencing these changes, right? On the one hand, when the city doesn't look so dilapidated, when there's more jobs and opportunities, maybe they were able to more easily reintegrate. On the other hand, housing prices are going up, and they may have trouble integrating into the city. They may have trouble affording to live in the city. So that led me, so I was interested in that, and that led me down this path of, okay, I should compare people from neighborhoods that have gentrified to people that are from neighborhoods that have not gentrified. So that's the basis of the study. And that led me down just a big rabbit hole, because it's not easy to assess whether or not, it's not easy to just give a yes, no answer to the question, has this neighborhood gentrified? And the reason for that is it's just not a simple binary thing. There's a spectrum. So I wanted to be able to identify neighborhoods that had gentrified and the neighborhoods that had not gentrified. So first thing I did was look at changes. So I looked at racial change, for example, because one of the most notable things about Washington, D.C. is we've gone from 70% Black to 40% Black as of the 2020 census. So there's been a huge decline in the Black population, but it hasn't been even. So what this map is showing you is actually some neighborhoods that are marked in blue have an increase in the Black populations, and some have as much as a 70% decrease. So as you can see, there's been uneven changes across the city. I actually want to call your attention just to this neighborhood and this neighborhood, because we'll keep talking about those two just to sort of give a sense of the perspective. So this neighborhood experienced a very significant decline in the Black population. This one experienced a slight decline, almost no change, and these actually experienced an increase. Okay, so then we could look at home value, right? So another way to measure gentrification is looking at the increase in home value. So as you can see, some neighborhoods experience a fourfold almost increase in home value, and others actually experience a decrease. So again, this neighborhood right here, extreme increase in home value, this one some increase, and then these two actually slight decreases. But again, you see the maps are not identical, right? And then we can look at household income as another way to measure gentrification. Has there been an influx of high earners into the city? So here, when we look at household income, we can see that some neighborhoods have as much as a 900% increase, and some actually have experienced a decrease in home value. So again, this one has a very significant increase. This one has some increase, and these neighborhoods over here in Southeast Washington, D.C. have actually experienced decrease in median household income. But again, like depending on which measure we're using, we would have a different answer to that question: has the neighborhood gentrified, yes or no? So then we can look at college degree, because college attainment can sometimes be seen as a more reliable measure, because you could have one person living in a house making $50,000, and then 10 years later, they're making 75, so they are the same person. But if we look at college attainment over the age of 25, it's more likely to be new people. So again, the neighborhoods that are darker have a greater increase in college educated, and the ones that are yellow actually have a decrease. And again, here we see significant increase, and over here we see some increase in the percent college educated. So obviously you could create a score, but it's really hard to decide the cutoff point. Like how do we decide an answer to this question? Yes, no, has the neighborhood gentrified, or how do we develop categorizations? So I felt like the census data was giving me some insight into some of the changes, but it wasn't complete. And I wanted to have a different measure of gentrification. And by the way, the website I'm looking at right now, you can find at mappinggentrification.com. So, okay, so I decided to look at what we would call 4 ideal types in order to have a closer look to sort of see how can we measure the changes at the local level. So I looked at this one right here, the one that I kept showing you, that like any measure of gentrification that you choose should show that that neighborhood is gentrified. Like in some reports, it comes out as the most gentrified neighborhood in the country, right? And this neighborhood right across the river from it, this is the Anacostia River right here. No matter how you measure it, you should come out as not gentrified, because that neighborhood in the study period of 2000 to 2018 did not experience positive changes in terms of the median income, median home value, et cetera. And this neighborhood over here was super interesting because it has experienced gentrification, but there has not been a decline in the Black population. So there's been a slight decline from 98% Black to 93% Black. So very small decline in the Black population, as opposed to here, which is like from 98% Black to 20%. So way different. And then this one was sort of in the middle, which has experienced some change, but not a lot. So these are our 4 like ideal types. And I won't be able to have time to go over each of these today, but I wanted to show you what we did in order to evaluate gentrification in 2 of the neighborhoods, and in order to show you what we did. Okay, so we're going to look at Census Tract 72, which nicely defines a neighborhood called a Navy Yard, although since it's gentrified so much, I'm sure they have a new name for it. I think it's like Capitol Riverfront, but it's traditionally been known as Navy Yard. And then we're also going to look at this other neighborhood, which is called Capitol View or Central Avenue, which is on the far eastern corner of the city. And what we did is, in addition to looking at just the census indicators, we actually implemented a housing survey that showed these changes in particular. So we used Google Street View to walk down each block in each of these neighborhoods, both sides. So we had a group of many undergraduate students with a graduate student named Carmen Salazar directing this study, looking at new signs of traffic, new public courtesy, signs discouraging disorder. And we used the Google Street View time travel feature in order to evaluate this. And I'll show you that briefly, just to give you a sense. So for example, if we look at this particular neighborhood, this is what it looks like today. But in 2007, it looked like this. So you can go back in time and sort of to see, have there been changes? So this is a Navy Yard. This is an area that was a construction site in 2007, and today is a luxury apartment building. So we use that feature of Google Street View to evaluate each of these indicators. And this was our way of assessing. So we did a complete census of these 5 census tracts, and then in addition to that, we did it on the whole city. But that work is not complete because we're still trying to answer that question, how we measure gentrification, and we haven't quite figured it out. But we do have our 4 or 5 samples, but I'm just going to go over 2 of them today. So the first one I want to go over is Census Tract 72 Navy Yard, which, like I said, has gentrified, like no doubt about it. The neighborhood has been completely 100% transformed. And also, according to the census indicators, it's increased significant changes. So it has median household income has increased 10-fold. The percentage of people with a college degree has increased 10-fold. The average home value has increased 3-fold. And the only reason that's so small is there was relatively little homeowner occupied housing in 2000. And then the Black population decreased from 95% to 24%, and the white population from 3% to 68%. So as you can see, this neighborhood has changed. So what we did is first give a little background of the neighborhood, but I won't go over that today. You can look it up if you're curious. And oops, okay. And what I want to show you is how we measured neighborhood change in the neighborhood. So first thing we did is create this map right here, which shows the census tract itself. And so the census tract is outlined right here. And then you can look and see, okay, how many signs discouraging disorder? Those are signs that say like no loitering, no smoking, et cetera, signs discouraging disorder. We also looked at vacant area beautification. These are like cafes, restaurants, et cetera. So the first thing you can look at is just kind of and I'll go over each of these individually, but as you can see, you can kind of turn on and off each of these things to see how much development, et cetera, and then how much affordable housing, just a little bit, right? So that's Census Tract 72, and we can look at, Yeah, so we'll go back to this tab. Okay, and look at the actual changes. I just want to show you some of them so you can see. So first of all, this is a description of the change that I went over earlier. And then we look at, we give an example. So this directly links to Google Street View. So I can hear there's a sign that says the sign discouraging, just sort of give an example of it so that when people look at the overall map layer, they can understand what they're looking at. And then, yeah, so here's, sorry, it's taking a minute to load. Okay, another example of beautification. So you see that this street right here is not just a typical little piece of grass. It has a little extra beautification there. And then it shows, after that, it's going to load the map that shows the instances of beautification. There you go, it takes a second to load. Yeah, and then I'll show you one more just so you can see commercial uses aligned with gentrification, which is just like a coffee shop, right? So for example, so there's certain businesses that we associate with gentrification, and a coffee shop is an example of that. So then we were able to then compare that to this other census tract, which I mentioned earlier. So this is called Central Avenue, and this particular neighborhood, according to census data, you would say that it's gentrified, but it's not to the extent of Navy Yard. The median household income has increased 81% as opposed to tenfold. Percentage of people over the age of 25 with a college degree increased 179%, like as opposed to tenfold. Again, median home value has increased 115%, but the Black population has barely decreased from 98% to 93%. So it's one of the very few census tracts in DC that has experienced an increase in all of the socioeconomic indicators, but has not experienced a dramatic decrease in the Black residents. So we wanted to see, wanted to compare this neighborhood to Navy Yard to see like what are the physical differences between the two neighborhoods. So again, we start out with a history of the neighborhood so people kind of get a sense of it. And this neighborhood is also super interesting because it was created as a Black middle class neighborhood in the early 20th century. And then a huge public housing project was built right in the middle of it. So what we realized once we dug into the data is that what actually happened in this neighborhood is just that the public housing project was demolished and replaced with mixed income affordable housing. So it just hasn't changed to the same way that Navy Yard has changed. And that becomes evident when we look at the overall layer. So you can see in this one, you can see that there's new public courtesies, but just a few. Sorry, that's resized itself, but just a few. Whereas though in Navy Yard, there's like evidence of public investment everywhere. There are new signs controlling traffic everywhere. There's not that many abandoned structures, just one here. In terms of major exterior decay, just a little bit, not a ton. Residents with major upgrades, a few. And also here, I wanted to show you like commercial uses aligned with cultural aspects of gentrification, they're actually zero. So what that means is that this neighborhood has changed in terms of the census data, but there actually are no new businesses in the area. There's no commercial development. Basically, the only thing in this area are a couple, like a liquor store, a corner store, a carry out, right? So there's none of the new developments that we see in Navy Yard or that we typically associate with gentrification, like coffee shops and clothing stores, or even, there's not even a grocery store in this whole, they have to travel pretty far from here to get to a grocery store. So the purpose of this was to allow people to kind of, since we won't say yes or no, it's gentrified because we still have to figure that out, but people can see for themselves, what indicators they think are most important. This is just, the presence of litter, residents with some minor upgrades. So the ones that are shaded darker have more minor upgrades. Residents that have new patio furnishing. So we see a lot of that over here. This part right here is where the affordable housing development is, but the rest of the neighborhood is working in middle class Black homeowners. So they haven't, the population hasn't changed, but the people themselves, update the furniture. But then we also see the presence of metal gates and fences, which are security measures indicating that people may still feel somewhat unsafe in the neighborhood. I'll go ahead and stop there, leave time for questions, and also happy to continue to talk. Obviously, there's a lot of material here, but I don't want to overwhelm.
Okay, so are there any questions?
I had one question in the chat, which was to share the story map link. It's just mappinggentrification.com. So I can put it in the chat, but the chat message will show like a long and complicated one. But in case you forget, it's just mappinggentrification.com.
Okay, thank you, Tanya.
Perfect. Yeah, that was my one question, is if because you have a tremendous amount of data, and these story maps are just an excellent way to share this type of information and explore it. So any of the participants here who want to dive into that, I would encourage you to do so. So thank you so much. We have a jam-packed program, so I would love to hear more, but I don't want to take time away from anyone else. So I will do the applause for Tanya. Thank you. And we're next to Rain, the board. Hopefully I got that correct. And you can go ahead and share your screen. I'm going to spotlight you also. And this is a two-screen day. So Rayan is the Associate Director of City Lab UCLA, an architecture and urban design research center focused on spatial justice. Trained in architecture and urban planning, her work focuses on housing interventions and access to public space. And I also wanted to extend, if anyone wants to do Q&A at the very end, we run into the lunchtime event, but if the speakers are happy to stick around and have an open discussion, I'm happy to keep things open also. So with that said, I will pass off the torch and move on.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Rain. I'm delighted to be back here for the second UCGIS week, and I'm making a little inversion. So last year I was a student presenting professional work. This year I'm a professional presenting student work. Who knows what next year will bring. But specifically what I'm sharing today is part of my capstone for the UCLA Masters of Urban Planning degree. Living Landscapes, a new approach for including unhoused Angelenos in park space and programming. So this work was conducted in partnership with the phenomenal landscape architecture and community planning firm Conquet Design Initiative, and hugely informed by Dr. Yo Kawano's Intro to GIS class at UCLA Luskin. It really started here by analyzing occurrences of park-based encampment reports in Los Angeles. As you'll see, this is actually utilizing Jupyter Hub and Python for data science analysis rather than GIS. And I think my cat just knocked over the router, so let me know if anything goes wrong. However, I think the questions posed within those forms of data science analysis in terms of just the way the data was analyzed and the particular data sets used open opportunities and provocations for GIS scholars at large. So like most of my work, Living Landscapes really takes an abolitionist approach to public space, asking how rather than calls for securitization and criminalization, we can consider services, mediation, and new ways of living together in community. I'm particularly interested in how we can restore the commons to stripped back neoliberal pay-to-play public space design and activation in service of low-income and unhoused neighbors. And as Los Angeles grapples with the housing crisis and the growing upheaval wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic, public parks are a really clear site of contestation. They're a communal site of leisure, protest, play, and increasingly of living. Parks really showcase a cross-section of the complicated relationships that mold our urban lives. This tension is especially prevalent in relationships between housed and unhoused individuals, particularly as that translates to perceptions of safety, sanitation, and comfort, all really coded language. This project questions how reimagining the role parks play in communities may become an opportunity to provide increased access to services for both housed and unhoused neighbors, and questions if accepting and supporting the necessary presence of encampments can actually lead to positive reform of park use and perception. The broader work here questions tendencies to divorce issues of unhoused living or dwelling from housed living or visiting in the park setting, and instead asks how the needs of all park users may be met while promoting safety, compassion, and dignity. What I'm sharing today is particularly from the first stage of this work, which was developed between September and December 2020, and significantly predated these changes in punitive policy across the city of Los Angeles targeted at breaking up encampments and disappearing unhoused Angelenos from public life, which I'll discuss at the end of this presentation in the hopes that some of you are interested in taking up the baton on similar and far more ambitious data science for social and spatial justice driven work. This research on occurrences of park-based encampment reports in Los Angeles really analyzes reports made to the Los Angeles 311 call center from 2015 to mid-December 2020 within park areas. Los Angeles 311 is a reporting center for non-emergency city services. 311 users can call, text, or write via an app or website to make service requests and or connect with a wide range of city services. On one hand, it's a valuable and efficient way to communicate urban issues like broken sidewalks, deferred or incomplete maintenance, trash pickup delays, legitimate public health concerns, all of which are publicly reported and available with daily, weekly, or monthly updates, depending on the exact code, via the city's open data portal. So this is just a treasure trove of urban data reporting and monitoring related to a wide array of city services. And to date, not a ton of scholars have utilized it. Partially, I think, because it's not always clear what this data is really telling us. You have to be relatively tuned into the inner workings of the city to recognize that you have the option to report on this platform. Also willing to make the time to report. Also, I don't believe that there's Spanish language options easily accessible. So in other words, there's a lot of bias here. You're capturing people who are very passionate about the 311 system, people who issue hundreds of reports a week on every possible issue, people who are deeply angry enough to be, again, issuing repeat requests possibly to the city. And this to me is exceptionally true in the case of this homeless encampment service request option, which you'll note is the only one directly related to other people, right? And offers perhaps the downside of programs like 311. This is deputizing Angelenos into the role not of neighbors, but of public safety officers, reporting and criminalizing other members of their community who are in housing situations of last resort. So I frame these as reports rather than service requests. And why is that? Because if we go to the 311 page and ask for more information about a homeless encampment service request, it's clear that this is a way to clean and clear encampments, not to provide services such as housing, healthcare, or resources. So 311 notes that the Los Angeles Municipal Code 5611 protocols will be followed, which may delay the cleanup day. Both this language and the repeated actions of the assigned agencies to sweep rather than service make clear that the service being requested is the forced removal of unhoused Angelenos at the request of housed constituents. Also telling is at the time of this initial research, these reports were actually hidden under the subtitle Public Right-of-Way Investigation. Now homeless encampment is its own heading. So within that context, I argue that these encampment reports are actually a powerful way to track neighborhood tension. Remember that this is an opt-in reporting process and one that's antagonistic, clearly oriented to removal rather than assistance. So through this data, I wanted to understand where park-based encampments are to find different ways to typologize parks and use these considerations to interpolate where services could be most impactful. To translate this into understanding where park-based interventions could be most impactful, I really narrowed down the data to park areas. And in addition to the 311 encampment report data set, this necessitated using LA County data for park amenity information and shape files for LA parks, council districts, and census tracts. So to get that data into a workable shape took a lot of spatial joining, adding frequency counts, and then dissolving repeat instances, such as joining those county park attributes to council districts, but also to the relevant park shapes. And this included creating geometry from latitudes and longitudes, cleaning up redundant info. So there's step-by-step information on that data scraping and scrubbing publicly available on GitHub for reference. But jumping into the data itself, a total of 136,638 encampments were reported from 2015 to 2020, with the number of reports increasing each year until 2020. And there may be many pandemic reported reasons for that, including Project Room Key, temporary camping allowances endorsed by the CDC, for example. And mapping these reports without any restrictions on geographies is really a mapping of Los Angeles. Encampments are reported in nearly every occupiable area. Where you don't see them is generally our mountains. That overall concentrations are in somewhat familiar areas. Downtown in Hollywood, with secondary nodes in Venice Beach and the Valley. And to give a similarly broad overview of parks, there are 425 parks in Los Angeles, but nearly 1/3 of these are park nodes, which are less than a quarter acre, or pocket parks, which are much more park-like, but still small, not really ideal for service provision. You'll see that I discounted these park types in further research. And on first joining together those parks and encampment reports, park-based encampment reports made up less than 3% of all reports. But really looking carefully at that mapping and digging into the data showed a lot of inconsistencies. There were lots of reports on park fringes that weren't being included, and half of all reports issued used approximate or unverified locations noted within the data. So I used a 1/2 block buffer to account for that information and boundary issue, to account for those fringes, for people reported as living in cars next to the park, and the fact that addresses are usually inputted as location markers, meaning that the reporter or answering agency will shortcut finding a park address by inputting the address of the closest building. The buffer accounts for all those inconsistencies while also acknowledging this is a project oriented to impactful service provision, which park adjacent encampments would also benefit from. And that raises the number of park area encampment reports over 500% to 17% of all of those encampment reports. This animated bubble map shows the annually shifting landscape of these park-based encampment reports from 2015 to late 2020. Notable are the Sepulveda Basin and Penmar Golf Course regions. And so as an interdisciplinary scholar and a graduate of the UCGIS Urban Humanities Initiative, I'm a really big believer that data tells a story, but that we need integrated humanist methods to fully understand that story. So I took peaking moments like this, where over 1,000 reports were made at the Penmar Golf Course and recreation area in a very short time span, to look for public media expressing tension or frustration via Twitter keywords and journalism. A more sophisticated data scientist might try to scrape meeting minutes from public agencies, which would be incredibly valuable, but is a little bit above my skill level, or in the case of manual searching, my time capacity. So just an idea for future work. In this case, though, Twitter and the local news really came through. For example, you can see reports here on the sidebar about the history of the Sepulveda Basin cleanups, which contextualize these through the ways in which unhoused individuals retreated further into the basin over the course of years to avoid harassment by authorities, particularly as fire risk heightened attention to those areas, drawing then connections between the housing crisis, climate change, and vulnerability. The Penmar Golf Course in particular is a devastating piece of evidence that these reports are indeed about neighborhood tension rather than urban documentation. So during the early phases of the pandemic, after stay-at-home and quarantine were initiated, and especially communal encampment formed in this area as people really sought to shelter in place, much like their housed neighbors. This approach to community care in the midst of a public health emergency was endorsed by the CDC. They recommended allowing encampment residents to shelter in place rather than moving to risky congregate shelters if housing was not available, and housing was not available here. Yet the surrounding housed neighbors self-professed, this is their words, to declare war on the encampment. One resident spoke about making dozens of reports in one day to try to trigger dispersal. And this data is a means of quantitatively tracking these efforts for displacement and some of the only evidence that this encampment existed, and to the extent that it existed, it was successfully displaced despite those CDC guidelines. In addition to those broader trends and stories, I also wanted to provide a map for more individual exploring. So there's a point in time map of 2019 that capture a full year encampment reports that also includes information like council district, park size and type, etc. And again, get more info if you click. Part of the goal of this phase of study was really to select key parks in late 2020 to be further studying. And rather than looking for those particular stories for each park, like Sepulveda and Penmar, and trying to make some qualitative decision on which was most meaningful for study or could be the most impactful for space and service provision, instead, spatial autocorrelation was my method of choice. I first normalized the data by finding park-based encampment reports per acre, which really shifts the parks in question to predominantly this area, Westlake and Hollywood area parks. Though it also shows the outsized impact of areas like Penmar, given that the vast majority of these reports came in a very short timeline. So this is that normalization mapped, as well as mapped then by spatial lag. And because I was interested in exploring the element of neighborhood tension, I looked for strong correlations with census data on income, race, home ownership levels, and was somewhat surprised actually not to see significant correlation there. So instead I began to look at these parks in relation to each other to determine this correlation, parks against neighboring parks. And this is just another one of those interactive maps. But testing for significance really reinforced that previously found northwest of downtown bubble as a study area. I used a highly statistically significant p-value and found that the area where park-based encampment reports per acre were both high compared to other parks and high overall was within this cluster further mapped. Here, if we zoom in. And as promised, I'll kind of end with a summary of where things stand in LA today and a call to action for other data scientists. So this research turned out to be in some ways really painfully accurate to what neighborhood parks would be targeted for evictions and displacement over the next year, as the city pursued policies which were the opposite of the stated research goals for this project for service, inclusion, dignity, and destigmatization. Earlier this year, actually, the Los Angeles City Council amended Ordinance 4118, which strengthens inequitably enforced sit-lie laws used to justify the banishment of unhoused individuals from public space. This also justifies large-scale police-led encampment evictions from public parks in the midst of an ongoing pandemic. That method was really pioneered in March 2021 at Echo Park Lake, which triggered a national conversation on the rights of unhoused individuals to public space, and has since been replicated at Venice Beach, MacArthur Park, and soon will be at Westwood and Westchester parks, all here in LA, all park areas of significance in this study under different metrics. These evictions are made under the guise of correcting deferred maintenance and increasing public safety, but instead practice policies of removal, banishment, semi-permanent enclosure of public space, and criminalization of poverty. Notably, street vendors are still not allowed back in the parks that have been swept either. And they're a huge part of Los Angeles's culture and informal economy. At Echo Park Lake in particular, only 4 of the over 180 people evicted from that encampment have received permanent housing, and at least 6 of them have passed away. So we desperately need spatial justice approaches to better serving all residents of our cities, which means including unhoused people as part of the public and within our public spaces. Under laws like 4118, which enable displacement and banishment, that data will be more difficult to track. Arrests and citations actually might become more telling than encampment reports. But I hope that some of you will join me in efforts to hold Los Angeles and similar policies and cities across California responsible for these actions and seek new ways to track presence, displacement, areas of tension. And I also hope that some of you are inspired to dig into the wealth of underutilized 3-on-1 data, and let me know if you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very well done. I know Tristan asked a question in chat, and I'll just present that to everybody. And because Tristan will be next, the presenter, but do you want to ask the question, Tristan?
Yeah, I mean, you did an amazing job utilizing the 3-1 data. And so just like kudos, that was a really great use of the data. And, you know, you have tracked some change through time, but I also think that this is really important baseline data for ongoing change detection. And just thinking about if that, you know, the amount of work that goes into capturing these data, what is your sort of thought or plan or approach to sort of using it as a long-term monitoring opportunity?
Absolutely. Like you said, it's really time. That's the restriction. Unfortunately, I keep saying every few months, oh, I'm going to go update this data. I'm going to go see directly what's changed. And because this is more continuation of a past project that was done without funding, that doesn't happen. That said, it's incredibly valuable community data. So I think this is part of why we need more community data science that is funded through some manner, whether that's grant funding or city subfunds. You know, I would love to be able to pass this off to a community group who cares about this and already has far greater skills than I do. But it's hard when you don't have that support. And then the other facet being more sophisticated data pulling. So I know there are ways, since this is continually updated data, to actually use methods that would just bring it in automatically day by day. So that's something that I hope to explore in the future.
Excellent. And if you're willing to share your story maps with the group in the chat, that would be really excellent. And I'll let Tristan get her presentation slides up. And again, thank you so much. Applause for Rain for her excellent work. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Tristan is a professor of geography from University of California at Santa Barbara. Tristan recently joined geography at UCSB at the Jack and Laura Dangerman Chair of Geography. Previously, she's been a professor at both Arizona State and the University of Victoria. Her presentation is Crowdsource Mapping of Barriers to Biking, Walking, and Rolling. So let's get rolling.
Nice one. I like that. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's really nice to be here. I've been at UCSB for just under a year. And so I'm really looking forward to getting to know many of my UCGIS friends, making new friends who like GIS. It's always exciting. So today I really want to talk about active transportation and some of the ways that we've been using crowdsource mapping to really support active transportation. So, you know, there's all kinds of benefits to biking, to walking, to being able to get around if you are in a wheelchair through rolling, or maybe you want to roll because we're in California on a skateboard or on a scooter. But as we do this, you know, we feel good, we get physical activity, it's good for our physical and mental health, it's good for the environment, it's good for the space use of our cities, and it allows people to create social connection. This picture is really old now, it's from 2014, but this is my family. And it was the day that we launched one of the projects I'm going to be talking about. But anyways, it's my favorite family photo ever. So whenever I can use it in a talk about bikes, I like to. You know, active transportation is complicated. There's, you know, our city transportation systems are complicated, and we need to really be able to support a diverse group of people. And you know, some of the groups that have been talked about today are some of the most underserved in terms of transportation, accessible transportation options. So, you know, certainly homeless people die at a higher rate than others due to vehicle pedestrian conflicts in particular. One of the issues that we have when we try and plan for the complexities of any transportation system, but certainly active transportation, is that there's a real lack of data. So while agencies might put a substantial amount of budget into collecting data on vehicles, it's not as typical to have hefty budgets for data collection on things like walking and bicycling. So it's estimated that only 30% of bike collisions are officially reported. So these are like police reports, insurance reports. There's no centralized reporting of near misses, and typically near misses aren't reported. But from a traffic safety perspective, that near miss data is really valuable for trying to respond early to issues that arise on our streets. And it also gives us a much bigger sample, so that when we want to detect change or look at how policies have improved safety, it's really helpful to have that near miss data. We also don't have data on just simple things like infrastructure for barriers to your mobility. So one of the things, if you're a bicyclist, that you might know is barriers to connectivity in bicycling through your city. But those kind of data sets are often, you know, hard to get your hands on. So in part, in response to this, so I came to this research, actually, I had been studying grizzly bears and forests quite a lot using GI science approaches, but I'm a passionate bicyclist. And so one day I was riding my bike home from work and I had a near miss and I was really mad. And I got home and I said, that's it. I'm going to start a website where we can vent about things that happen when we're on bicycles, and we're going to call it Flip the Bird, and people can tell their stories there. Well, cooler heads prevailed. First, my husband looked at me kind of weird. So that was the first indication I needed to maybe rethink my approach. And then I called a researcher who studied bicycling, and she said, Trisselyn, you know, this is a really important issue because we don't have good bike safety data. And so we developed and launched Bike Maps, and it's been running since 2014. And the goal of Bike Maps is really to be a crowdsourcing tool that helps us fill gaps in safety data. So we collect crash data, near miss data, hazard data, and it's been used in over 40 countries worldwide. And it's been funded primarily in Canada, where it was developed. This started when I was at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. And it's in a number of languages, including Spanish, French, Icelandic, because some folks in Iceland got funding from their local government to promote it there. Also German, so that's fun for us. But you report on there, just, you know, you feel like you're kind of on a Google Maps type environment, and you search around to the spot where you had an issue and drop a pin. And then we ask for a number of details about the incident. Were you injured? What's your experience with bicycling? A number of other things that we can use in modeling. But we find the most useful part of these data are the narratives that people provide. So there's kind of an open-ended spot where people can tell us what happened. And we really find that mining that data, both kind of through text analysis, but also just having someone sit down and read them all, it's super helpful for trying to understand what's happening for people out there on the roads. We have a visualization page, which allows you to look at how many collisions and near misses you're having reported, how these vary throughout the days of the week or time of the day, and it interacts with the map, so you can zoom around the map, and these are all dynamic. The funnest thing about Bike Maps, well, there's many fun things, but one of them is it's a crowdsource project. So you need to let people know that you want their data. And so we've had all kinds of fun promoting this, everything from making birthday cupcakes for the project to here I am very happily delivering water bottles that have a little note inside that say, tag, you've been selected to improve bicycling safety. And then we deliver them on parked bikes around town, kind of like the Easter Bunny. Here's my colleague Megan Winters in Vancouver, where we're putting rain covers on bike seats that are parked outside. That's not maybe going to work so well in California, but we'll have some other ideas for here. The number one thing cities want from these data are hotspot maps. So we usually take the bike maps data and any other data we can find. We put it all together and we make them maps of the worst spots for bicycling. And because we have those nice narratives, we can attribute these maps with what some of the issues are. And cities have used these maps to actually make investments to improve bicycling in their cities. This is another infographic that we made where a controversy developed in Vancouver over a particular part of the road on 10th Ave. And we had all of the data from bike maps just sitting there that we could use to inform what the issues were really in terms of that conversation. So this is one that we've published and promoted as well. Ever since we launched bike maps, people have said, well, what about pedestrians? And that's right. What about pedestrians? So in the US in 2019, 850, just over 850 people died while bicycling, but pedestrian deaths have exceeded 6,000 people in 2019. And we are seeing increases in bicycling and pedestrian deaths. So we recently, just last month, launched a new project, which is also funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada, called Walk Roll Map. And the goal of this project is, it's similar to bike maps in that we're using crowdsourcing, but the audience and I think the goals of the project are quite different. With something like bike maps, you can tweet out to people who see themselves as bicyclists, hey, we want your data. But you don't see people really identifying as, oh yeah, I'm a pedestrian. That's less common. We actually, most of us are all pedestrians at one point or the other. And the other thing that's important about pedestrians, I think, is that with bike maps, we're really thinking about improving data. But here with Walk Roll Map, we're really interested in improving access for underserved groups. So a lot of the work is in developing the technology, but it's also in strengthening community partnerships in order to access folks that perhaps are not going to be the first to jump on your crowdsource tool and provide you data, such as older adults, people with disabilities, underserved communities that are either low socially SES, LGBTQ, BIPOC, homeless people. These are groups that are not going to just pop on your phone, use your app, and provide you some data. And yet they're the groups that we most need to serve when we think about better facilities for walking and rolling. The tool collects data, allows you to report data on micro barriers, safety and comfort, missing amenities. So perhaps you'd really like to walk to the grocery store, but you're an older adult and you need a break before you get from your house to there. So a bench would be really nice and create accessibility. We do have incident data, just like on bike maps, as well as demographic data, and then also description of what people are experiencing or looking for. But a lot of the work that's happening right now and a lot of the funding for this work is really about outreach. We have a student in Canada who's working right now on what are the best ways to engage older adults in collecting these types of data. So we're actually thinking of, we're going to kick it old school with a phone number and some flyers where you rip off the little tag and our older adults can just call and let us know. We'll ask them some questions, try and identify the location on our map, and we'll enter the data for them. So we think it's going to be, the grad students are excited. We're going to have some fun with this. This is what it looks like. So we just launched it last month and we already have some good data in some of the cities that we are partnering with. But things like, a bridge needs sidewalks on both sides are the kinds of things people can report. Now, one thing is when you want to analyze safety data, it's a lot like trying to analyze COVID data. So we got the data from bike maps and we set off to analyze it. And then we realized that we needed exposure data. So this is like with COVID, you can report the number of cases, or you can report the number of cases divided by the population. And after nearly 2 years, we're all looking for that positivity data, which has a numerator and a denominator. And bicycling safety and pedestrian safety data is very similar. So if you say, you know, I had one bicyclist and one crash, well, that's a very different situation than I had one crash, but I had 1,000 bicyclists. And if you don't have good exposure data and you're doing safety analysis, then as you build infrastructure that increases accessibility and leads to more people biking and walking, you run the risk of always making it look like that infrastructure led to more injury, which it probably didn't. So we've been trying to get our hands on good data on walking and bicycling. And it's harder to do than you might like, but this just gives you an example. So along here, the y-axis is the number of incidents reported in Ottawa, Canada on bike maps. And then along the x-axis, these are the days of the week. And then you can see we have a couple different kinds of counter data that give us a sense of how many people were out riding. And you can kind of compare those. So that's okay. And you can see like Thursday, you have a lot more people reporting injury than riding, whereas on the weekend, these are a little bit more consistent. This is okay, but we're GIS people. We want these data spatially. So we've been playing with Strava data for a number of years and trying to figure out if we can use Strava data to represent ridership so that we can do the safety analysis. And I wanted to put this in here because it's a different kind of crowdsourced data. So people use Strava when they're out fitness riding and they track their rides, but all that data gets compiled and aggregated into a data set that Strava Metro now provides free. They used to charge for it, but it's free now. The difficulty with Strava data, though, is that it is biased towards the people that ride using the fitness app, which is going to be, you know, more white people, more experienced bicyclists, more men, people really that already have good access to bicycling. So we have been trying to consider Strava data a sample of ridership that can be mapped everywhere. So any street segment, you can get a sample of the number of Strava riders every 15 minutes continuously. So it's really dense data, but it's a biased sample of data. So can we use GI science to basically correct that biased sample to make it representative of all bicyclists? And it turns out that we can. I'm not going to get too much into the details, but I'd be happy to point you to those if you're interested. But basically, there are some correlations between Strava ridership and all ridership. It's just that the slope of these lines vary. And so it's our job to use GI science and geography to figure out what the slope of the line should be for any particular street segment or neighborhood. So we basically see adjustments like this. So in some locations where it's like a recreational route with lots of hills, one Strava rider is actually maybe pretty representative of most all the riders. But on a quiet neighborhood street where you have lots of children riding and maybe less experienced riders, you're going to see that one Strava rider is representative of 100 riders. So you missed 100 of them. So you need to be able to geographically weight these adjustments. And so that's what we've been doing with these data. So in all the crowdsourced data that we're working with, you know, there's some lessons that we've learned that I just wanted to highlight to end. And first of all, when we use crowdsource for mapping, crowdsourced data are not representative of all people. So they're representative of the people that have access to technology, which I think is really important because, you know, we're often trying to serve communities, like we heard from the two speakers before me today. We're trying to serve communities that are not always going to be the ones that have access or interest, or that it's even good for them to be providing this data. And so we need to be really cognizant of that. But it's also true that official data are often not representative of everyone either. So police data on bike crashes are not representative of everyone. They tend to be more severe incidents. If you're an undocumented resident, you're not going to be wanting to call the police if you've had an incident on your bike. So, you know, a lot of the times in GIS, we use official data, but it's rarely collected for the purpose of research. So I think it's just interesting to think about what is the information content of each of these kinds of data, and then where is the data really missing, and what field work do we need to do to really fill in those gaps. You know, funding for crowdsourced projects is a challenge. So I have found it's easier to get funding to build the tools than to maintain them or to do the outreach needed to sustain data collection, particularly when you're trying to do sort of, more meaningful stakeholder engagement. That can be hard. Outreach needs to focus on these underserved stakeholders. And an interesting thing, and something that I actually feel some shame about in my own research, is that this research needs to be done in diverse cities, not just white cities. So if you look at big data for bicycling, it is all done in Portland, San Francisco, Ottawa, we've done a lot in. They're all predominantly white cities. And the reason is that we go where we can find good ground truth data. So these are cities that already have a lot of bicycling, and people are collecting on ground bike data that we can use to train our models. But this is not the way forward, because we've just continued to reinforce the systemic biases that we know better than to do that. And so the next phase of the work that we're doing in our lab is really going to focus on thinking about how do we collect the ground truth data that we need in these diverse communities. How do we build those partnerships so that we can do a better job of serving everyone? And then I also think, more generally, I've realized, because I'm often looking for, okay, if I'm using crowdsourced data, where's the training data? What's the truth data? Well, often doesn't exist, because many of the data sets we use in GI science are these opportunistically sampled data sets. And so we need to think about what are frameworks and mechanisms that we can use to really understand and communicate the sampling framework or lack of it in our data, so that we can monitor and try and understand better what these data sets mean. So lots of friends and colleagues that have supported this work that I wanted to just give a shout out today. These are all big projects, and I'm grateful for these awesome people that are great team members. And here's my contact information. And thank you so much for being here and listening.
Thank you so much. And I knew this was going to be really compact and just wonderful presentations. And I want to make sure we might go late if that's okay. But we have 3 presenters lined up. I'm going to go ahead and let's see. Get them switched over with Oliver and Ikoko, and trying to find you guys. And Oliver, if you can introduce your team. I know I have your bios in front. I just, for time, you're all 3 undergraduate students at UCLA studying very different different disciplines, and I'm excited to see what you all have for us today. So thank you so much. I'm just gonna pass it over so we can keep rolling.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So yeah, I'm Oliver. My teammates are Ikuko and Sam. We're all undergrads at UCLA, working on a project that's kind of centered around waste streams at UCLA and trying to make UCLA in general a more sustainable campus. So that's kind of our shared interest and our shared project. And I think we can begin and pass it off to Ikuko.
All right. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Ikuko, and we are presenting on behalf of the Renewable Energy Association at UCLA, and specifically the Renewable Natural Gas Project. And we're going to be discussing bin identification, waste rectification, our multi-stream waste data collection strategies at UCLA. So first, going into our motivation for studying this. You can go to the next slide. Great. So our project is focusing on quantifying the energy potential of UCLA's waste and whether or not a circular waste and energy system at UCLA would be feasible and beneficial and productive on our campus. And so specifically, we're focusing on the energy potential of UCLA's organic waste through the use of a biogas digester, which converts organic waste into methane that can then be used for biofuel. So in order to quantify and statistically analyze the diversion of organic waste from UCLA's campus, take accurate and more standardized data measurements and find trends in waste reduction, we developed a bin labeling system for all of the bins on campus, which will be the bulk of our talk moving forward. So I'll pass it off to Oliver.
Great. So here's kind of the map and the data itself. So what actually is it that we're talking about? So what we've done is we've taken every single bin at UCLA and geotagged it. And after that, we've assigned it a unique identifier. So you can kind of see here in the picture an example of what we're talking about. Here are 3 UCLA bins. So when we say bin, this is like exactly what we're talking about. So now every bin on campus has both a location and alphanumeric code associated with it. And furthering what Ikuko just mentioned, we're in the process of taking these identifiers and physically placing a label with them on every bin at UCLA, just like these. So when someone wants to understand something about a specific waste stream from one bin or multiple, there's a really well-defined way to talk about it, and that's our hope. We hope that this can kind of act as a platform for future study at Waste at UCLA, specifically around these bins. So for example, if someone's doing a waste audit and they're trying to like actually take waste out of these bins to analyze if people are sorting correctly or kind of how the system as a whole works, all someone has to do is mark the identifier in the bag, and we know like the exact bin on campus that this waste has come from. Cool. So here's the labeling system itself. We won't get too far into it, but it is 6 alphanumeric characters, and you can see the picture here of the actual labels that we ordered. We have an example of 2055PR, which is one of the bins on campus. So the first character is the campus zone. UCLA Facilities Management has split the campus into 3 zones based off the kind of waste collection routes. The next is the bin number within the zone, ordered by latitude. And the next 2 are the cluster in the stream. So if we can see in the previous slide, this is like a cluster of 3 bins. So bins at UCLA and a lot of different places are organized into little collections of bins. So we have had a letter denote all the different clusters that are extant on campus. And then the last letter is the stream, so landfill, recycle, or compost. Great. So here's kind of briefly our methods. First was to create the preliminary system kind of at the start, so we could actually go out and collect data on these bins. The next is to create the team of data collectors and to actually geotag each bin. What we did is we used a collaborative Google Earth project where each person collected the GPS data on their smartphone by walking around campus. We had a preliminary map that was made by Facilities Management, which was the best map that they had, which is a paper map. So we had that to kind of guide us in a direction of where we thought the bins were. And then after that, to actually go through our campus where bins are not on this map to make sure and find bins that are like unrecorded, essentially. So we've done that. Did a peer review process where the different data collectors reviewed a new zone that they hadn't before to make sure that the previous collectors had done it correctly. And then to kind of convert out of the Google Earth format, combine all the KMLs, and then clean the data and get it into GeoJSON shapefiles. So we combined it in R, removed cluster types that didn't actually exist, add ones that did that we didn't expect, and then actually generated the labels. I mentioned that all of the numbers in the kind of second component of the code were ordered by latitude. So that was done with geospatial packages in R. And then we finally assigned the final IDs and associated those with the point geometric data. So then we exported to get that vendor kind of like design of the labels that I just showed you. And then we created a map of all bins with some density that Ikuko will talk about.
All right, so starting off, this is just a simple map of all of the waste bins on campus. And so we included the bin labeling system that Oliver just mentioned in the box on the left. As you can see from the count on the right of this slide, there are already a disproportionate amount of landfill and recycling bins on our campus and few compost bins relative to that. But if we move on to the next slide, we made maps of the kernel densities of all of the different streams, so landfill, composting, and recycling. And as you can see, the landfill bins are relatively well distributed in this area of campus. For context, we just excluded the top, the west portion of campus because that's
the waste bins over there are run by a different facility on campus. As you can see, the landfill bins are pretty well distributed, and you'll notice that same pattern exists with the recycling bins as well. But the kind of interesting thing we found with regards to the density of bins is that the composting bins, which are already few and far between as is, are really kind of focused in the south corner of our campus. And so, you know, the areas that we focused on in the northern portion have very little composting bins for students and, you know, faculty and staff to access. If you go to the next slide. So if you're interested in collecting the data, this is a link to the GeoJSON and CAML files that Oliver collected, all kind of centralized in this GitHub link. And now I will pass it off to Sam.
Okay, so based off of the work that we have done, here are the potential directions and next steps that we hope to take in the near future. So our immediate and top priority is to conduct a campus-wide waste audit using our collected bin data. With this identification system, we can figure out the current measurements of waste production on campus and host targeted campaigns and events for waste reduction accordingly. In addition to this, the Renewable Natural Gas Project is also researching solutions to reduce UCLA's carbon footprint and to create a more circular and efficient waste management infrastructure on campus. Our bin identification system will help gauge the success of these proposed changes and hopefully contribute to UCLA's sustainability goals overall. Next slide, please. Lastly, we would just like to take a moment to thank everyone who has contributed to this presentation, including our waste processing members and geotaggers who went out physically and labeled everything, as well as our UCLA advisors. And the last slide is our contacts if anyone has any questions in the future or just wants to reach out to any of us. And so this concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you all. What a great program. These are just excellent case studies and very creative and innovative and useful. And I'm just really grateful you gave your time to do this today. And so I'm going to see if anyone in the audience is willing to ask any questions to the group. Let me check the chat.
I didn't see any questions. I just had a comment.
Okay, go for it.
Oh, like at UCSB, we have a similar program, except they haul out all the compost, make compost, and then distribute its products out to like all the gardening groups on campus.
So do they do the processing of the compost on campus, or do they send it out to a facility off campus?
I think like there's somewhere on campus where they're doing this. UCSB isn't like that urban, so like I think they probably do the composting close to the student garden plots. So that makes a little bit more sense, but oh yeah. So it's somewhere on campus. I'm not quite sure where it is, but like you'll see all these students from like who are part of like the waste facilities group and these little tricycles hauling all the compost around campus. Anyway, yeah, that was just my comment.
I was just making sure I was on mute. Anyone else want to join in the discussion? I'm going to get the Zoom link for the next event. Well,
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Tristan, I really appreciated that your research actually started as a space to make conversation and further community, and the different roles that all of our work and ways of approaching this work can make room for that seems very compelling and really a way to make the work thrive beyond our own research projects.
Thank you.
I'm just, oh, no, I meant to send that to everybody. This. Just linking to the lunch event if you're willing to participate and join in, or check the program on our website for the next presentations that are starting at 1 o'clock. Again, thank you so much to all the speakers. This was just an excellent session. And we have a great program moving forward. If you're not able to attend any of these sessions, we are going to do our best to hit record when things are started and get the recordings available to everyone who's registered. So on that note, if no one else has any other questions or comments, we will say goodbye and do the courtesy Zoom wave and see you all next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.